So I guess to start off, I kind of feel like my presentation kind of sticks out like a sore thumb because we're this like really beautiful natural area surrounded by all of these woods and wonderful natural setting. And I'm going to kind of switch things up completely and talk about things more in an urban ecosystem. I did my bachelor's in ethnobotany, but I've been focusing on urban ecology over the last year or so. And so it kind of influences the sort of the perspective that I'm taking here. And one thing I feel like it's important to keep in mind is that while a lot of people do live in these gorgeous settings, for just as many people, and actually more people now, as we'll see in a moment, our surroundings aren't all beautiful trees and forests and these wonderful plants. It's also the built environment. It's an aerial of New York City. So just for context, you know, for some of us, this is more accurate to what our surroundings are like on a daily basis. So urbanization trends, according to the UN, we hit a tipping point where 50% of the world's population was living in urban settings as of 2008. I believe as of 2014, we were kind of keyed to be around maybe 54% of the population is urbanized now. But by the year 2050, it's going to be 2/3 of the global population will be living in urban systems. And so in recent years, urban ecology has become more and more popular, because we do need to focus more on how things are changing, how we're interacting with our environment in an urban setting. But when you talk to urban ecologists, or when you talk to, say, urban planners or designers, architects, there's an inherent difficulty in examining the social aspects that are involved. And it's something that you see all over the place. This trend from moving from ecology in the city, where we take the same ecological tactics that we've used previously to study how we interact with our environment and just kind of plug them down in the city. It doesn't really apply so much because the environment is so built. And so ecology of the city focuses more on examining that human role, but again, we have some difficulties with that. And so the title of my talk was about an industrial ethnobotany, which is kind of, I've made it up, so it's kind of meaningless to everybody so far. So what I mean by that is that when you get into these built environments, it's not just landscaping that plants are used for. They're also being incorporated more and more for functional aspects that aren't particularly well understood for the social dynamics as well as the sort of engineered component. So we do have, urban ethnobotany that's, has a strong history of an examination primarily of how traditional ecological knowledge has changed as it moves into the city. But I would argue that there's also an importance to examining sort of the non-traditional ecological knowledge. For many people who grew up in cities or in urban settings, that traditional knowledge isn't really an influence, whereas our relationship is still ongoing and our relationship with our environment doesn't change at the edge of the woods. So kind of go over some examples of plant inclusion in green infrastructure. This system here may come to surprise some people. That is a sewage treatment plant. That system is a living machine system. That's a trademark term. And what they do is they have the same general like settling tanks and the process that you'd see in any conventional sewage system, but with the additional use of plants as a component within that system. And depending on who you talk to, it's kind of variable whether you believe or not that the plants are doing a highly active role within the system. But it's certainly possible, and if nothing else, it helps to reduce things like smell, and I would much rather visit a sewage system plant that looks like this versus the ones I've been to before that are not nearly so pretty. Some other examples of green infrastructure, things like bioswales and constructed wetlands that are useful for like stormwater mitigation. These bioswales you'll find in a lot of urban cities, especially in the Northeast, where stormwater runoff is a problem and something that needs to be managed. So this one is from New Haven, Connecticut, where the Urban Resources Initiative and the Hickson Center have identified spots throughout the city where they've been able to cut into the curb, put in these systems, and they just reroute the stormwater that would otherwise be flooding the streets through there, so it gets a degree of filtration and removes some of the pollutants that would otherwise be going back into the river systems or traveling through to a sewage treatment plant. Similarly, constructed wetlands. A lot of times if you see like a wetland area, you won't even know that it's constructed essentially. And they're pretty highly engineered, but they do look more natural. And they give a lot of benefits to people aesthetically, but also to things like providing resources for pollinators or providing habitat for wildlife. Similarly, green roofs. It's another one that's useful for stormwater mitigation, but you'll also find that a lot of places are starting to incorporate things like producing areas that are designated for native plants. So this is from the Botanical Research Institute of Texas, where they have an all-native rooftop garden to help for, it's for education, outreach, and again for things like benefits to wildlife. My primary focus today, though, is going to be on green walls because that's somewhere that I have a little more expertise, which they actually have a lengthy history. They were designed, they first proposed in the 1920s by Stanley Hart White, the brother of E.B. White, but really you haven't seen so much implementation until recent years. So like a couple of these are just like Google trends, but you can see sort of the gradual upward tick in popularity of searches for green walls over the last few years. And these things can take a lot of different forms. You can have something as basic as just growing ivy up a wall, or very highly engineered modular systems that can be installed separately. So some of the reasons why I want to talk more about green walls when discussing this topic is it's useful as a microcosm. And this is sort of a broad topic, and it helps to dig down a little bit and have some focus. It's also a relatively small industry. And as such, it gives me a little bit more access to some of the individuals on the ground, and I can have a broader view within the industry that way. And again, the selection of species is often very deliberate, so that is very useful in terms of looking at what the social aspects are that are being incorporated there. It also exemplifies a lot of challenges because it's, again, these tend to be highly engineered, and there are a lot of if you're going to like building green walls or trying to design or construct them, you run into a lot of hurdles and a lot of complications that's inherent to the built environment and really does sort of play into the values that are going to be incorporated as these are implemented. So my personal background with this, I've been working for the last year on this THERMOGREINWALL project, which is an NSF-funded project at the Urban Ecological Design Lab at Yale, where if anyone here is familiar with conventional cooling systems, you have water that circulates through and it becomes heated because it's drawing the heat out of the building, and then it gets run through these large industrial towers. And they have a lot of problems in terms of things like Legionella breeding within those water systems, and so it requires a lot of cleaning, a lot of maintenance, and also as we're getting more and more into urban environments, it's a space that's available that could otherwise be utilized for additional benefits. So far, what we've been doing is, instead of having the big cement cooling towers, we run the heated water through a green wall instead to see if we can get any, or what degree of active heat rejection we can get from that. So far we've been looking at the engineered aspects of that in terms of how much heat we can reasonably reject, say, per square foot. But also things like the response of the plants, because with the hot water running through the roots, you're going to have a very strange response because it's not a natural setting for these plants. And also things like water quality impacts. And we've got an outdoor prototype that'll be going up shortly. So some of the research objectives that I've developed based off of this project, in addition to understanding things like whether we can use this system as a component of a cooling system to help green the urban environment a little bit more, is looking at the environmental co-benefits. So where you get things like heat rejection or mitigation of urban heat islands, there's also potential for things like air quality improvement, stormwater mitigation, and benefits to wildlife, etc. But there's also trade-offs because with all of those you also get difficulty of maintenance. Some of the plants that are going to perform better in these walls might not be viewed as being as aesthetically valuable as other plants that are conventionally used in landscaping. But it's also useful just for gaining an understanding of social aspects of the built environment and for examining some of these feedbacks within these systems. So for this project, again, these are some of the questions that I'm looking at examining, and this is one of the plants we've included in our wall prototype so far, is the blue flag iris versicolor, which performed reasonably well, but we're always examining new plant options. So some of the research questions we're looking at are, how are these species selected? How do people dig down to, like, this is something that I want in this wall? Is it just an outgrowth of, say, the landscaping industry where these are the things that we're used to using? Or are we selecting more based off of different cultural values? For example, on our project, because it's a lot of ecologists working on it, we were really invested in examining using native plant species. But are those always the most appropriate? And that's just on our project. So if you go to other projects, how is that going to change? Are people going to value different things instead? So some of the ways I'll be approaching this is by looking at just making site visits to existing green walls that have already been constructed, conducting semi-structured interviews, primarily with green wall professionals, mostly because it's a little easier to get in touch and because it's a smaller group. If I were to continue this project on later, I would be really interested in talking to the people that, say their client base, to see what degree of input they have and whether these things kind of line up with what they're looking at doing. So the semi-structured interviews are complete. I'm also generating online surveys to help give a little more quantifiable data, just to kind of go over these things. So I actually have a little extra time. Amazing. So just a quick tip of the hat to my collaborators on the ThermoGreenWall project and my funding organizations. And so I should actually have time for questions.